Trump has spoken to Qatar's emir about the ongoing crisis in the Gulf. The deadline for a series of demands imposed on Qatar by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt and Bahrain has been extended until Wednesday. Well, these demands include shutting down the news network, Al Jazeera, and ending alleged terror financing. But is that list of demands reasonable or intentionally impossible to achieve? Well, to discuss this, we're joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University of Birmingham, and also Chris Doyle, Director of the Council for British Arab Understanding. Scott Lucas, to you first of all, remind us, why is Saudi Arabia so cross with Qatar?
Well, there's been ongoing rivalry between Saudi and Qatar, even though they're Gulf neighbors, for decades. But the specific issue between them has been that Qatar has links with, for example, Palestine's Hamas and with the Muslim Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia doesn't like those movements, so it frames those as being the terrorist and extremist whom the Qataris are supporting. And then there's an internal issue here, and that is that the 31-year-old now crown prince, recently promoted Mohammed bin Salman, is pursuing a very aggressive policy in the region. He very much wants to put Iran on the defensive, and he very much wants to stamp his authority on relations with neighboring states. And he's decided that Qatar is the state that he wants to push back, especially in the context of the ongoing, very difficult intervention by Saudi in another Gulf state, the civil war in Yemen.
So Chris Doyle, that's the background. This list of demands that Saudi have given to Qatar, I mean, it is, as I said in my introduction, is it intentionally unachievable, do you think? Are they just doing it as a bit of sword rattling, saber rattling?
It's an extraordinary list of demands because essentially it would mean that Qatar would become a vassal state of Saudi Arabia. It would surrender its foreign policy. It would surrender and close down its media stations, not just Al Jazeera, the entire network and other branches of its media output. And there's simply no way that it's going to do that. It's not going to shut down also the Turkish base in Qatar. I mean, other states in the region have such bases. So I think that certainly the Qataris have concluded that these 13 demands are not in any way something that they can agree to, and they see it as an attempt by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to force it into an abject surrender. I think the obvious conclusion is that this crisis, unnecessary as it is going to carry on for a very long time. I mean, if you are a Syrian, an Iraqi, a Yemeni, and you look at this, you need this like a hole in the head, because the region is beset by really serious crises where millions of people are suffering. And you see these sorts of divisions that only aid, frankly, Iran and ISIS, who are profiting from this disunity, even Russia as well. So the sooner that this can be de-escalated and sorted out, and we get back to reasonable demands of all parties, the better for everybody.
Scott Lucas, do you think that de-escalating this can come about diplomatically? I mean, it's, you know, as Chris was saying, the list is an extraordinary list. They are asking a great deal, aren't they, Saudi Arabia? How can we row back from this?
Well, I think there's two things that mean they could come to the table and try to find a face-saving compromise. The first is that far from making Qatar surrender, it's pushing it into an effective alliance with Turkey and indeed with Iran, who of course is the rival of the Saudis, because those two countries are providing a lot of the food and supplies needed by Qatar amidst the Saudi-led blockade. And I think the second reason, and we'll have to keep an eye on this, is that the U.S. State Department and the Department of Defense, not necessarily President Trump, are very upset with the Saudis over this. They don't want to see this escalate, not least because there's a base with 11,000 U.S. personnel in Qatar. I think those factors could actually move us towards compromise, but we have the wild card here, and that is the new effective driving force in Saudi foreign policy, Mohammed bin Salman.
Well, you mentioned Donald Trump. He's actually just tweeted in the last few minutes about this. He said he spoke yesterday with the King of Saudi Arabia about peace in the Middle East. Interesting things are happening. Chris Doyle, why do you think he got involved in this way? Do you think there was a lack of understanding about the links between the US and Qatar and the fact that he had this great big American base there? It seems an odd thing for him to have done, to initially waded into this with Saudi Arabia, appearing to back Saudi.
Well, there's a whole frenzied industry in trying to second guess why Donald Trump says and tweets what he does. he certainly historically has had not really a strong interest in Middle East politics, and therefore a lot of people have concluded that perhaps he didn't realize when he started tweeting in support of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates exactly the implications for US policy, because as Scott Lucas rightly said, Qatar is actually at the center of the US-led anti-Daesh, anti-ISIS coalition's efforts in Iraq and Syria. And he, I think, failed to see the dangers for US policy in the region, not least against Iran as well. If you see these states are engaged in this sort of very dangerous bickering and slagging each other off in their media, I mean, if you look at the Saudi and the Emirati papers, they read like the worst of British tabloids in terms of their coverage of Qatar. So I think that the State Department and the Department of Defense in the United States, even the CIA, have probably shifted American policy into a far more pragmatic and sensible approach. They have been consistently demanding that the demands made of Qatar have to be reasonable and ones that can be expected to be carried out. And that's a policy position that is also reflected amongst European powers, including Britain. None of these states want to see this sort of argument between their allies. It's not in our interests.
Scott Lucas, do you think Britain should be doing more to get involved with this? I mean, we talked about Al Jazeera. Of course, this is a company that employs lots of British people, lots of British journalists work for Al Jazeera. Shouldn't the UK government be doing more to intervene here and try to calm the situation down, or would that be an unwelcome intervention?
I suspect there are people in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office who are working behind the scenes, but it has to be part of a multilateral effort. As Chris points out, there really needs to be an established European position. There needs to be cooperation with the United States and indeed with other Gulf states, such as Kuwait, who is trying to broker a face-saving negotiation. I think the Middle East is now a region where no one country can wade in and try to reshuffle the deck in terms of what might happen. So I think a very discreet, low-key, but effective policy of cooperation is what Britain should be pursuing.
And Chris, you're nodding to that very briefly, or your final response?
Very important in Gulf politics is always this issue of face-saving that Scott Lucas mentioned. We need to find a way. It's highly personalised, these politics, between these leaders of how they can actually roll back from where they were before, how they can actually step down, because this could be one of the biggest impediments to a deal. Having gone so far out on a limb, the leaders in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates cannot give up without achieving something, and Qatar is not about to give up either.
Chris Doyle and Scott Lucas, thank you both very much.